The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine carefully arranged white roses in a crystal vase. She loved these quiet moments before the children woke up. The house felt peaceful and normal, far removed from the constant attention that followed their every public move. She hummed softly to herself, thinking about the day ahead and the simple family dinner they had planned. Her private secretary Emma burst through the door with unusual urgency. Emma never ran, never looked flustered, and never interrupted Catherine during her morning routine. But today was different. Emma clutched a thick folder against her chest, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled from rushing. "Ma'am, we need to discuss the Caribbean tour immediately," Emma said, slightly out of breath. Catherine set down the roses and turned to face her secretary. Something in Emma's voice made her stomach tighten with worry. The Caribbean tour was supposed to be a celebration, a joyful trip to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. They had been looking forward to it for months. "What's happened?" Catherine asked, studying Emma's troubled expression. Emma opened the folder and spread several documents across the polished wooden table. Newspaper headlines, official letters, and diplomatic cables covered the surface. Catherine read the words that would change everything about their upcoming journey. "Jamaica wants to remove the Queen as head of state," Emma explained quietly. "Barbados already did it last year. Now other Commonwealth nations are following. This tour isn't a celebration anymore. It's become something much more serious." Catherine sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She had prepared for garden parties and school visits, not for nations potentially saying goodbye to the British monarchy forever. The reality of what this meant began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. "Where's William?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's in a meeting with the Foreign Office. They've been talking for 2 hours already," Emma replied. "The palace wants both of you to understand the full situation before you make any decisions about the tour." Catherine picked up one of the newspaper articles. The headline read, "End of Empire. Caribbean nations ready to break royal ties." Below it was a photo of protesters holding signs demanding independence from British rule. Her hands began to tremble as she read about the anger and hurt that had been building in these nations for years. She thought about her children sleeping peacefully upstairs. George, Charlotte, and Louis had no idea that their parents were about to embark on the most challenging and emotionally difficult tour of their lives. How could she explain to them that some people were angry at their family for things that happened long before any of them were born? Emma sat down beside Catherine and spoke gently. "The palace advisors are meeting this afternoon. They want to discuss whether you should still go. Some think it might be better to cancel the tour entirely." "Cancel?" Catherine looked up sharply. "We can't just hide when things get difficult. That's not what the Queen would do." But even as she said the words, doubt crept into her mind. What if their presence made things worse? What if people saw them as symbols of oppression rather than hope? What if their good intentions weren't enough to bridge decades of pain and resentment? The sound of car wheels on gravel announced William's return. Catherine watched through the window as her husband stepped out of the official car. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders and the worried expression on his face. He walked slower than usual, as if carrying an invisible weight. When William entered the morning room, he looked directly at Catherine. In his eyes, she saw the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt in her own heart. Without saying a word, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "This is going to be the hardest thing we've ever done," he whispered into her hair. Catherine held him tightly, feeling the rapid beating of his heart against her chest. She knew he was right. This tour would test everything they believed about their role, their purpose, and their ability to make a positive difference in the world. "Are we ready for this?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. William pulled back to look at her face. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this, but we have to try. These nations deserve to hear us acknowledge their feelings and their right to choose their own future." Catherine nodded, though her stomach still churned with anxiety. The woman who had been arranging flowers an hour ago was gone. In her place stood someone who would have to navigate the most complex diplomatic and emotional challenge of her life. The Caribbean tour that was meant to celebrate would instead become a test of character, courage, and the very future of the Commonwealth itself. William sat surrounded by tall stacks of history books in his private study at Kensington Palace. The clock showed 3 in the morning, but sleep seemed impossible. Every page he turned revealed another painful chapter of British colonial history that he had never fully understood before. His coffee had grown cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. Catherine found him there when she came downstairs to get water for Charlotte, who had woken up with a bad dream. She paused in the doorway, watching her husband's troubled face illuminated by the desk lamp. Books about slavery, plantation systems, and colonial exploitation covered every surface of the room. "You need to sleep," Catherine said softly, entering the study. William looked up with tired eyes. "How can I sleep when I'm learning about things that my ancestors did? Things that people in Jamaica and Barbados still remember and still hurt from." Catherine sat on the arm of his chair and looked at the open book. It showed a map of sugar plantations and the routes of slave ships. The reality of what their family represented to some people was becoming clearer and more painful with each page. "We can't change the past," Catherine said, running her fingers through William's hair, "but we can acknowledge it honestly." The next morning brought a parade of experts to the palace. Historians explained the economic systems that had enriched Britain while impoverishing Caribbean nations. Cultural advisors warned them about phrases and gestures that might be misunderstood. Diplomats shared intelligence about planned protests and the mood in each country they would visit. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian specializing in Caribbean studies, sat across from William and Catherine in the formal meeting room. She spoke directly and without sugarcoating the harsh realities they needed to understand. "Your Royal Highnesses, you must understand that for many people in these nations, the British monarchy represents centuries of exploitation," Dr. Mitchell explained. "The wealth that built your palaces came partly from the labor of enslaved people in these very islands." Catherine felt her cheeks burn with shame and discomfort. She had known about slavery in general terms, but never connected it so directly to her own life and position. The jewels she wore, the palaces she lived in, the very lifestyle she enjoyed had roots in this painful history. William asked the question that had been haunting him. What can we possibly say or do that would matter? How do we show we understand without sounding like we're just reading from a script? Dr. Mitchell leaned forward. "Honesty. Don't pretend the pain isn't real. Don't make excuses. And most importantly, listen more than you speak." That evening, William and Catherine tried to explain the situation to their children during dinner. George, being older, asked difficult questions that made both parents realize how little they themselves had understood before this crisis. "Why are people angry at us, Papa?" Charlotte asked innocently. "We didn't do anything bad." William struggled to find age-appropriate words. "Sometimes families do things that hurt other people, even before we were born. And we have to take responsibility for making things better, even if we weren't the ones who caused the hurt." Catherine watched her husband try to explain inherited responsibility to their young children. She saw how much this was weighing on him, how seriously he was taking their role as representatives of institutions that had caused real harm. Late that night, Catherine found William standing at their bedroom window, staring out at the London lights. She joined him, and they stood in silence for several minutes. "I keep thinking about all the royal tours where people smiled and waved," William said quietly. "Were they just being polite? Were they hiding their real feelings because they had to?" Catherine took his hand. "Maybe some were, but that doesn't mean we can't try to do better. We can't undo history, but we can choose how we face it." William squeezed her hand. "I'm scared, Catherine. What if we make things worse? What if our presence just reminds people of everything they want to forget?" "Then we'll learn from that too," Catherine replied. "We'll keep trying until we get it right." Neither of them slept well that night, knowing that in just days They would face the most challenging test of their lives together. The aircraft touched down in Belize City with a gentle bump that made Catherine grip William's hand tighter than usual. Through the small window, she could see the waiting area below. Something was different from their previous royal arrivals. The usual crowds of excited people waving flags were much smaller. Instead, she noticed more security personnel and news cameras than celebrating locals. William adjusted his jacket one more time and took a deep breath. His face showed the tension they both felt. After days of studying painful history and preparing for difficult conversations, they were finally facing the reality of their changed Caribbean tour. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine whispered as they heard the aircraft door being opened. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," William replied quietly. "But we have to try." The humid tropical air hit them immediately as they stepped onto the aircraft stairs. The temperature was warm and welcoming, but the atmosphere felt different from any royal tour they had experienced before. Even their practiced smiles seemed more careful and uncertain. Catherine noticed that the official greeting party was smaller than expected. Several local dignitaries who were supposed to welcome them had canceled at the last minute. The handshakes were polite but brief. The usual warmth and enthusiasm she was used to feeling from Caribbean visits seemed replaced by cautious formality. As they walked toward their waiting car, Catherine spotted a group of protesters gathered near the airport fence. Their signs were too far away to read clearly, but their presence sent a clear message. This visit was controversial in ways their previous tours had never been. The drive through Belize City revealed more signs of the changed situation. People on the streets went about their normal business without the excitement that usually followed royal motorcades. Some looked curious. Others seemed completely uninterested. A few held up phones to record their passage, but without the usual smiles and waves. "Your security briefing mentioned that several community leaders declined to meet with us," their private secretary informed them during the car ride. "There are also organized social media campaigns encouraging people to ignore the visit entirely." William stared out the window at children playing in front yards and adults chatting on street corners. The normal life continuing around them made him realize how isolated their royal bubble usually was from everyday reality. Their first official engagement was at a family-run cacao farm outside the city. The Santos family had been chosen because their farm represented positive cooperation between British agricultural experts and local Belizean farmers. It was supposed to be an uplifting story about partnership and progress. Maria Santos greeted them warmly but with noticeable nervousness. She led them through rows of cacao trees, explaining how new farming techniques had improved their crop yields. Her husband Carlos joined them to demonstrate the chocolate-making process that their family had perfected over generations. Everything seemed to be going well until William asked an innocent question about the farm's history. Carlos paused in his chocolate demonstration and looked thoughtful before answering. "My grandfather worked these same fields when they belonged to a British plantation company," Carlos said slowly. "He worked from sunrise to sunset for wages that barely kept our family alive. The profits from his labor went across the ocean to make other people wealthy." Catherine felt her stomach tighten. Even this carefully chosen positive engagement was connected to the painful colonial history they were trying to understand. "Things are much better for us now," Carlos continued diplomatically. "We own our land and control our profits, but people in our community remember the old times. They remember who became rich and who stayed poor." During the chocolate tasting portion of their visit, a young worker named Elena shared her dreams of expanding the farm's direct trade relationships with international buyers. But when Catherine asked about the biggest challenges facing young farmers like Elena, the answer was more complex than expected. The same international companies that controlled trade during colonial times still control most of the profitable export routes, Elena explained matter-of-factly. Political independence didn't automatically create economic independence. William and Catherine exchanged glances. This wasn't the straightforward success story their briefing materials had suggested. But it was honest, and it was exactly the kind of reality they needed to understand. The Santos family invited them to share a simple lunch of rice, beans, and fresh fruit under a shade tree. As they ate together, Catherine found herself asking questions she had never thought to ask during previous royal visits. How had recent government policies affected their business? What did they hope would change in the relationship between Belize and Britain? The answers were thoughtful and nuanced, neither hostile nor overly positive. The Santos family appreciated certain forms of cooperation, but also valued their independence and wanted their voices heard in decisions that affected their lives. As they prepared to leave the farm, Carlos walked with William toward their car. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, "we appreciate that you came to listen to us. Many important visitors come here, but never ask about our real experiences. What would you want people in Britain to understand about Belize today?" William asked. Carlos considered the question carefully. "That we are proud of our independence and our achievements, but we also want partnerships that benefit everyone equally, not arrangements that mostly help one side." The drive back to their hotel was quieter than the morning journey. Both William and Catherine were processing what they had learned from the Santos family. The farm visit had been positive, but also complicated, just like everything else about this tour was proving to be. That evening, they sat on their hotel balcony looking out at the lights of Belize City. The sounds of normal evening life drifted up from the streets below. People were having dinner with their families, children were playing, teenagers were socializing. "I keep thinking about what Carlos said," Catherine spoke quietly, "about his grandfather working those same fields for almost nothing while the profits went to Britain." William nodded, "And about how political independence didn't automatically fix the economic problems. I never really understood that distinction before." Catherine pulled her sweater closer around her shoulders as the evening air grew cooler. "Tomorrow we go to Jamaica. If today felt challenging, I can't imagine what's waiting for us there." "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," William said, reaching for her hand. "And we'll keep listening, even when it's uncomfortable." Neither of them slept particularly well that night, knowing that their education in uncomfortable truths was just beginning. The Santos family invited them to share a simple lunch of rice, beans, and fresh fruit under a shade tree. As they ate together, Catherine found herself asking questions she had never thought to ask during previous royal visits. How had recent government policies affected their business? What did they hope would change in the relationship between Belize and Britain? The answers were thoughtful and nuanced, neither hostile nor overly positive. The Santos family appreciated certain forms of cooperation, but also valued their independence and wanted their voices heard in decisions that affected their lives. As they prepared to leave the farm, Carlos walked with William toward their car. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, "we appreciate that you came to listen to us. Many important visitors come here, but never ask about our real experiences. What would you want people in Britain to understand about Belize today?" William asked. Carlos considered the question carefully. "That we are proud of our independence and our achievements, but we also want partnerships that benefit everyone equally, not arrangements that mostly help one side." The drive back to their hotel was quieter than the morning journey. Both William and Catherine were processing what they had learned from the Santos family. The farm visit had been positive, but also complicated, just like everything else about this tour was proving to be. That evening, they sat on their hotel balcony looking out at the lights of Belize City. The sounds of normal evening life drifted up from the streets below. People were having dinner with their families, children were playing, teenagers were socializing. "I keep thinking about what Carlos said," Catherine spoke quietly, "about his grandfather working those same fields for almost nothing while the profits went to Britain." William nodded. "And about how political independence didn't automatically fix the economic problems. I never really understood that distinction before." Catherine pulled her sweater closer around her shoulders as the evening air grew cooler. "Tomorrow we go to Jamaica. If today felt challenging, I can't imagine what's waiting for us there." "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," William said, reaching for her hand. "And we'll keep listening, even when it's uncomfortable." Neither of them slept particularly well that night, knowing that their education in uncomfortable truths was just beginning. The sounds of chanting protesters could be heard even before William and Catherine's plane landed in Kingston. Through the aircraft windows, they could see crowds gathered beyond the airport barriers, holding signs and banners that were clearly visible even from the air. Catherine gripped William's hand tighter than she ever had during a landing. The Jamaican officials who greeted them were professional, but notably reserved. The usual warmth and enthusiasm that characterized Caribbean welcomes was replaced by careful politeness. Catherine noticed that several government ministers who were supposed to attend the arrival ceremony were conspicuously absent. As their motorcade moved through Kingston streets, the presence of protesters became impossible to ignore. Groups of people lined the route, some waving Jamaican flags, others holding signs demanding reparations and independence from the monarchy. The chants were loud enough to be heard even inside their secured vehicle. "No more king, no more queen, Jamaica must be free," echoed from the crowds. Catherine watched William's jaw tighten as he processed the directness of the message. This was unlike anything they had experienced in their years of royal duties. Their first official engagement was at a cultural center showcasing Jamaican arts and music. The program was designed to celebrate the island's rich heritage, but even this positive event carried undercurrents of tension. Local artists performed traditional dances and songs, but several pieces clearly contained themes of resistance and liberation. During a poetry performance, a young woman named Amara took the stage. Her words were powerful and direct, speaking about breaking chains and forging new paths. Catherine found herself genuinely moved by the performance, but also acutely aware that every metaphor about chains and freedom was directed at what her family represented. "We honor our ancestors who survived, who resisted, who dreamed of the day when we would choose our own destiny," Amara concluded, looking directly at William and Catherine. The applause from the local audience was thunderous and sustained. After the performance, William made a decision that surprised his security team and palace officials. Instead of moving on to the next scheduled event, he asked to speak privately with Amara and several other performers. Catherine supported his choice immediately, though she could sense the nervousness of their staff. The conversation that followed lasted much longer than anyone expected. William asked questions about the performers' perspectives on Jamaica's relationship with Britain. He listened as they shared stories about economic struggles, limited opportunities, and the psychological impact of remaining tied to former colonial powers. "Your Royal Highness," said Marcus, a musician who had performed earlier, "many of us respect you as people, but the system you represent still affects our daily lives. Our courts still answer to your grandmother's courts. Our money still has her picture on it. It's hard to feel truly independent." Catherine found herself asking her own questions, wanting to understand how ordinary Jamaicans viewed their presence. A young teacher named Grace explained how difficult it was to teach children about national pride while colonial symbols remained everywhere. "When my students ask why a foreign queen's picture is in our classroom, what am I supposed to tell them?" Grace asked. "How do I explain that we're independent but not really?" That evening, against the strong advice of their security team, William insisted on meeting with community leaders and protest organizers. The meeting was arranged at short notice in a community center in downtown Kingston. Catherine stood by his decision, though privately she worried about the political implications. The 3-hour discussion was unlike any royal engagement in recent memory. William and Catherine sat in a circle with about 20 local leaders, activists, and residents. There were no prepared remarks, no official protocols, just honest conversation about history, hurt, and hopes for the future. One elderly man named Samuel spoke about his grandfather's experiences as a sugar plantation worker. "My grandfather died never owning the land he worked his whole life," Samuel said quietly. "Every day he saw the wealth he helped create leave this island and go to England. That's not ancient history to us. That's our family story." Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to story after story of how colonial policies had affected real families for generations. The abstract historical facts she had studied became personal and immediate through these individual accounts. A young mother named Keisha challenged them directly. What can you actually do to make things right? Not your government, not your institutions, but you personally. William was quiet for a long moment before answering. I can listen. I can learn. I can make sure that when decisions are made about Jamaica's future, they're made by Jamaicans, not by people in London who don't understand your reality. The meeting ended after midnight. As William and Catherine returned to their hotel, both were emotionally drained, but also strangely energized. They had participated in the kind of honest dialogue that royal protocols usually prevented. That was the first real conversation I've had about our role since we got married, Catherine told William as they prepared for bed. William nodded. I feel like I understand something I never understood before, but I also feel like we have so much more to learn. Neither of them realized that their willingness to engage authentically with Jamaica's difficult questions would completely change how they approached the rest of their tour and their royal duties afterward. While William spent the morning meeting with Jamaican government officials about constitutional matters, Catherine visited a women's shelter in one of Kingston's most challenging neighborhoods. Her protection team had initially resisted the visit, calling it too risky and off-message. But Catherine had insisted, wanting to connect with real people facing real struggles. The shelter, run by a remarkable woman named Patricia Williams, housed 30 women and their children who had escaped domestic violence or extreme poverty. Catherine arrived without the usual fanfare, her security detail keeping a respectful distance as she entered the simple but clean building. The women gathered in the shelter's main room were initially shy and uncertain about meeting a member of the British royal family. Catherine could sense their discomfort and decided to abandon the planned formal introduction. Instead, she sat down in the circle of chairs and simply asked if anyone would like to share their story. Sarah, a young mother holding her 2-year-old daughter, was the first to speak. She talked about leaving an abusive relationship with nothing but the clothes on her back and her child. Patricia had taken them in and helped Sarah find work at a local clinic while providing childcare for her daughter. My grandmother used to clean houses for wealthy British families who lived here when she was young, Sarah said quietly. She always told me that education was the only way to change our situation. Now I'm studying nursing at night while I work during the day. Catherine listened carefully, struck by how Sarah's determination reminded her of stories her own grandmother had told about working during World War II. Despite the vastly different circumstances, there was something universal about mothers wanting better lives for their children. What do you hope for your daughter? Catherine asked. Sarah's face lit up as she looked at the little girl playing with blocks nearby. I want her to grow up knowing she can choose her own path, not limited by what people think she can or can't do because of where she comes from or what she looks like. Other women began sharing their stories. Maria had started a small catering business from the shelter's kitchen. Jennifer was learning to read at age 25, having never had the chance to attend school as a child. Rose had escaped an arranged marriage and now helped other young women understand their rights. Catherine found herself genuinely moved by their resilience and creativity in overcoming enormous obstacles. She realized that these women possessed strength and determination that her privileged upbringing had never required her to develop. When the scheduled time for her visit ended, Catherine asked if she could stay longer. Against the protests of her staff, she spent an additional hour helping children with art projects and joining them for lunch. The informal time allowed natural conversations to develop. 8-year-old Destiny showed Catherine a drawing she had made of her family. In the picture, her mother wore a nurse's uniform, and they lived in a house with a garden. Mama says if I work hard in school, all my dreams can come true, Destiny explained. Catherine felt something shift inside her as she listened to this child's hopeful plans. The weight of her own privilege became clearer, but so did the potential for using that privilege constructively. These women and children weren't looking for charity or pity. They were looking for opportunities and respect. During an unguarded moment, a photographer captured Catherine laughing genuinely as she joined a group of children playing hopscotch in the shelter's courtyard. Her hair had come loose from its careful styling, and her dress was wrinkled from sitting on the floor with the children. The photo would later become one of the most shared images from the entire tour. However, not everyone interpreted the image positively. That evening, Catherine was devastated to read social media comments accusing her of using vulnerable children as photo opportunities for royal publicity. Critics suggested that her visit was a calculated attempt to improve the monarchy's image in Jamaica. Back in their hotel room, William found Catherine crying in the bathroom. She sat on the floor with her phone, reading comment after comment questioning her motives and sincerity. The genuine connection she had felt with the women and children at the shelter suddenly seemed tainted by public cynicism. "They think I was just pretending," Catherine sobbed. "They think I used those children for photographs. How can I prove that it was real?" William sat beside her on the bathroom floor and gently took the phone away. "You can't prove your heart to people who have decided not to believe in it," he said. "But Sarah knows it was real. Destiny knows it was real. That matters more than what strangers on social media think." Catherine leaned against his shoulder. "I keep wondering if they're right, though. Am I just a privileged person playing at understanding real problems? Can someone like me ever truly connect with someone like Sarah?" William was quiet for a moment. "Today you spent 4 hours listening to women tell their stories without trying to fix them or give them advice. You played with their children and laughed with them. You didn't perform charity. You showed up as a person, not just as a duchess." That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Sarah's dreams for her daughter and comparing them to her hopes for Charlotte. Despite their vastly different circumstances, both mothers wanted the same fundamental things for their children: safety, education, and the freedom to choose their own futures. She realized that her role as a royal wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about using her platform to amplify voices like Sarah's and to ensure that their stories were heard by people with the power to make changes. The criticism had hurt, but it had also clarified something important for Catherine. She would rather be accused of imperfect sincerity than praised for perfect performance. The flight to Nassau felt different from their previous arrivals during the tour. William and Catherine had learned painful lessons in Belize and Jamaica, and both felt changed by the experiences. As their plane descended toward the Bahamas, they could see the crystal-clear waters and pristine beaches that made the islands famous. But they also knew that beneath the tourist paradise lay complex challenges. Their first engagement was supposed to be a celebration of marine conservation efforts, but even before they arrived at the venue, environmental protesters had gathered to highlight the island's vulnerability to climate change and rising sea levels. The demonstrators weren't hostile, but their message was clear. The Bahamas faced an existential threat that required immediate global action. Dr. James Knowles, a marine biologist from the University of the Bahamas, explained how coral reefs were dying from warming ocean temperatures. He showed William and Catherine underwater photographs that documented the devastating changes happening to marine ecosystems that supported both tourism and local fishing communities. "Your Royal Highnesses," Dr. Knowles said directly, "the Bahamas could lose 30% of our land area to sea level rise within 50 years. We need countries like Britain to take climate change seriously, not just make promises." Catherine found herself asking detailed questions about the science and the timeline of predicted changes. William inquired about what specific actions the British government could take to help. Their questions weren't scripted or diplomatic. They were genuine attempts to understand a crisis that could literally erase island nations. Later that day, they attended a youth forum at a Nassau high school. The event was supposed to be lighthearted, focusing on education and cultural exchange. But the young Bahamians who attended had different priorities. They wanted to talk about their uncertain future on islands that might not exist when they were adults. 16-year-old Marcus Thompson stood up during the question session and asked Catherine directly, "Do you feel guilty about being rich and privileged when people in countries like ours are suffering from problems that wealthy countries mostly caused?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine's media training had never prepared her for such direct confrontation from a teenager. Palace protocol suggested deflecting difficult questions or giving diplomatic non-answers, but something about Marcus's sincere expression and the attentive faces of his classmates made Catherine decide to abandon her careful preparation. She was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. The room was completely silent as students, teachers, and media representatives waited for her response. "That's a really important question, Marcus," Catherine finally said. "I do think about privilege a lot, especially during this tour. I was born into advantages that most people don't have, including you and your classmates. I didn't earn those advantages, and I can't pretend they don't exist." She paused, aware that every word was being recorded and would be analyzed later. But for the first time during the tour, she decided to prioritize honesty over careful diplomacy. "I don't think guilt alone helps anyone," Catherine continued, "but responsibility does. If I have privileges and platforms that others don't have, then I have a responsibility to use them to help address problems like climate change that affect everyone, but hurt some people much more than others." William watched his wife with admiration and surprise. This wasn't the cautious, well-prepared Catherine who had started the tour. This was someone who had been changed by the difficult conversations and genuine encounters of the past week. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and asked a follow-up question. "What will you actually do differently when you go home?" Catherine looked around the room at the faces of young people whose futures were genuinely uncertain due to forces beyond their control. "I'm going to learn more about climate science so I can speak about it knowledgeably. I'm going to use my platform to make sure people in Britain understand what's happening to island nations. And I'm going to ask harder questions about whether the projects I support are actually making a difference." The conversation that followed was unlike any royal engagement in recent memory. Students asked challenging questions about economic inequality, environmental justice, and whether traditional monarchy had any relevance in addressing modern global problems. Both William and Catherine answered honestly, sometimes admitting they didn't know enough about certain issues. 18-year-old Keisha Williams asked William about reparations for slavery. Instead of deflecting, William acknowledged that it was a conversation Britain needed to have seriously, not just dismiss or delay. "I can't make decisions about reparations," William said, "but I can make sure that the conversations about historical justice don't get ignored or pushed aside. Your voices deserve to be heard in Britain, not just in the Bahamas." When the forum ended, several students approached William and Catherine individually. They shared personal stories about family members who had emigrated due to economic challenges, about dreams of studying abroad that seemed financially impossible, and about fears that their island homes might literally disappear. That evening, Catherine called her children via video chat. When George asked how the trip was going, she found herself telling him honestly about the difficult questions she had been asked and the important things she was learning. "Are people angry at us, Mama?" Charlotte asked from the screen. Catherine considered her answer carefully. "Some people are disappointed in things that happened a long time ago, sweetheart. But they're also hopeful that we can do better in the future. That's why it's important for us to listen and learn." After the call ended, William found Catherine standing on their hotel balcony, looking out at the ocean. "You were remarkable today," he told her. "I've never seen you speak so honestly in a public setting." Catherine turned to face him. "I realized that trying to be perfect was actually making me dishonest. These young people deserved real answers, not diplomatic speeches." William joined her at the balcony railing. "I think we're finally understanding what this tour was supposed to teach us. It's not about managing the monarchy's image. It's about figuring out what role we can play in addressing real problems." Neither of them knew it yet, but the video of Catherine's honest exchange with Marcus would go viral within hours, not because it was perfectly crafted, but because it was genuinely human. The emotional weight of the tour began affecting William and Catherine in ways neither had anticipated. Catherine started waking up at 4 in the morning, unable to fall back asleep as her mind replayed conversations with protesters, activists, and ordinary people who had shared their pain and frustrations. She would lie in bed listening to William's restless breathing, knowing he was struggling with the same thoughts. Their daily routine became strained. Simple decisions about their schedule or public statements turned into lengthy discussions about potential consequences and interpretations. The easy partnership that had characterized their marriage was being tested by the complexity of their situation. The breaking point came during a private moment in their Nassau hotel suite. William had just finished a difficult phone call with palace officials in London who were concerned about the negative media coverage from Jamaica. Several British newspapers were criticizing their handling of the tour, suggesting they were being too apologetic about Britain's colonial history. Maybe we should consider declining future tours to nations that are planning to leave the Commonwealth, William said, exhaustion evident in his voice. If our presence just reminds people of everything they want to forget, what's the point of going? Catherine looked up sharply from the briefing papers she was reviewing. You want to give up. You want to only visit places where people will smile and wave and pretend everything is fine. That's not what I meant, William replied, but his tone was defensive. I'm trying to be realistic about whether we're actually helping or just making things worse. Since when is avoiding difficult conversations realistic? Catherine challenged. Your grandmother never ran away from hard situations. She faced them. William stood up abruptly and walked to the window. My grandmother also never had to deal with social media campaigns calling for the abolition of the monarchy or students asking her about reparations for slavery. So that means we should hide. Catherine's voice was rising, something that rarely happened in their private conversations. Those students in Nassau deserved honest answers, not diplomatic avoidance. That's what being royal should mean in the 21st century. And what if honest answers destroy the institution we're supposed to represent? William turned back to face her. What if our honesty convinces more countries to leave the Commonwealth? What if we're the generation that presides over the end of everything our family has built? Catherine stared at her husband, seeing fear and uncertainty that she had never witnessed before. But she also saw something that disappointed her, a willingness to retreat rather than grow. Maybe some things deserve to end if they can't change, she said quietly. Maybe the Commonwealth should only include countries that choose to stay, not countries that feel obligated to stay. You don't understand the implications of what you're saying, William said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. This isn't just about us. It affects the entire royal family, the government, Britain's international relationships. And you don't understand that those relationships were built on foundations that hurt people, Catherine replied. We can't preserve something by pretending its problems don't exist. They stared at each other across the hotel room, both realizing they were having their first serious disagreement about their royal role. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door from their private secretary, reminding them about their evening engagement. During the formal dinner that night, photographers captured several tense moments between them. Catherine's hand withdrew quickly when William reached for it during a toast. William's smile seemed forced when Catherine was speaking with local officials. A conversation between them stopped abruptly when cameras turned in their direction. Palace staff began to worry about the couple's dynamic. Their usual easy interaction had been replaced by polite formality that looked awkward to observers. Speculation about tension between them began appearing in gossip columns and royal watching websites. That night, they prepared for bed in uncomfortable silence. Catherine removed her jewelry with sharp, angry movements. William loosened his tie and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I don't want to fight with you, Catherine said finally, her voice softer than it had been earlier. I don't want to fight either, William replied. But I'm scared, Catherine. I'm scared that we're in over our heads and making mistakes that will have consequences we can't predict. Catherine sat beside him on the bed. I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of being people who choose comfort over doing what's right. William looked at his wife, seeing the determination in her eyes that had attracted him to her in the first place. What if what feels right to us isn't actually what's best for everyone else? Then we keep learning and trying to do better, Catherine said. But we don't stop trying. They sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the intensity of their disagreement and what it revealed about their different approaches to pressure and responsibility. "I've never seen you back down from anything important," William said quietly. "Maybe that's what I need to remember." Catherine took his hand. "And I've never seen you care more about appearances than substance. Maybe we're both being pushed to become better versions of ourselves." "Even if it's uncomfortable?" William asked. "Especially if it's uncomfortable," Catherine replied. Neither of them realized that their willingness to argue honestly about their values, even during one of the most stressful periods of their marriage, was actually strengthening their partnership. They were defining their shared principles under pressure, which would ultimately make them more effective as a team. The photographers who had captured their tense moments that evening had no way of knowing that the couple arguing about their royal duties was actually the couple becoming more committed to each other and their mission. On their second to last day in the Bahamas, weather forecasters began tracking a massive storm system approaching the islands. Hurricane warnings were issued, and government officials started preparing evacuation procedures for low-lying areas. William and Catherine's final scheduled events were supposed to be ceremonial visits to tourist attractions and cultural sites. But as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon and the first bands of rain began hitting Nassau, everything changed. Reports came in that several communities were already experiencing flooding, and emergency shelters were being opened for families whose homes were at risk. The storm was arriving faster and with more intensity than predicted. "Your Royal Highnesses," their security chief announced during an emergency briefing, "we need to move you to the airport immediately. The storm track has shifted, and we can't guarantee safe departure if we wait much longer." William and Catherine looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Through their hotel windows, they could see people loading sandbags onto trucks and families carrying belongings to higher ground. The idea of fleeing to safety while local residents faced potential disaster felt wrong. "What kind of help do the emergency services need?" Catherine asked, surprising her security team. "Ma'am, our priority is getting you safely off the island," the security chief replied firmly. "The local authorities can handle the emergency response." William stood up from the briefing table. "The local authorities are overwhelmed. We have 2 hands each, and we're physically capable of helping. What's the most useful thing we could do?" The room fell silent. Palace protocol had no provisions for royals participating in emergency disaster response. Their insurance policies, security arrangements, and diplomatic status all assumed they would be evacuated from dangerous situations, not staying to help with them. Catherine pulled out her phone and called Patricia Williams, the shelter director she had met in Jamaica. Patricia had connections throughout the Caribbean and would know what was really needed on the ground. "Patricia, it's Catherine. We're in Nassau, and there's a hurricane coming. What do the emergency shelters need most right now?" Catherine asked directly. After a brief conversation, Catherine hung up and turned to the room. "Food preparation, child care for families in shelters, and help filling sandbags to protect the most vulnerable areas. Those are the immediate needs." Against the strong protests of their entire security team, William and Catherine made the decision to stay and help rather than evacuate. They changed from their formal clothes into jeans, rain jackets, and boots. Within an hour, they were at the largest emergency shelter in Nassau, ready to work. The scene at the shelter was controlled chaos. Families arrived constantly, carrying whatever belongings they could manage. Elderly residents needed help getting settled. Children were scared and crying. The small staff was struggling to manage the influx of people, while also preparing for the storm's expected arrival. Catherine immediately went to the shelter's makeshift kitchen and began helping prepare meals for the hundreds of people who would need to be fed throughout the night. She worked alongside local volunteers, learning their names and following their lead on how the operation functioned. William joined a crew of men loading sandbags onto trucks destined for the most flood-prone neighborhoods. The physical work was harder than anything his royal duties had ever required, but he found it strangely satisfying to contribute something concrete and immediate. As word spread that the British royals were staying to help instead of fleeing, something unexpected happened. The local response was overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, the usual barriers between them and ordinary people completely disappeared. Working side by side with Bahamians facing potential disaster, William and Catherine discovered a kind of connection that formal receptions had never provided. When you're filling sandbags together or serving food to evacuees, conversations become natural and real in ways that protocol prevents. Maria, an elderly woman whose waterfront home was being evacuated, sat next to Catherine while they organized supplies for families with small children. "You know, honey," Maria said to Catherine, "I never thought much of royalty before. Always seemed like fancy people playing dress up. But here you are, getting your hands dirty when you could have run away." Catherine smiled as she sorted children's clothing donations. Running away felt wrong. This is where we are today, so this is where we should help. William found himself having similarly direct conversations while he worked. A young father named David, whose house was directly in the storm's predicted path, asked William why he had decided to stay. "Because leaving while you and your family faced this alone would have made me feel like a coward," William answered honestly while they loaded another truck with sandbags. David nodded approvingly. "My grandmother always said you can tell a person's character by what they do when things get difficult. I guess that applies to princes too." As the evening progressed and the storm intensified outside, the shelter became a small community. William and Catherine ate the same simple dinner as everyone else, sitting on folding chairs and sharing tables with families they had just met. Their presence wasn't ceremonial or symbolic. They were just additional hands during a crisis. A photographer from a local newspaper managed to capture an image that would become iconic. The photo showed Catherine sharing her umbrella with an elderly woman named Mrs. Johnson, while William carried Mrs. Johnson's small suitcase and helped her navigate the wet ground to the shelter entrance. Both William and Catherine were soaked, their hair plastered to their heads by the rain, but they were both smiling. The image spread rapidly on social media, but this time the response was different from the criticism they had faced earlier in the tour. People shared the photo with comments about authentic leadership and genuine service. Even some of their harshest critics acknowledged that staying to help during an emergency demonstrated character. More importantly to William and Catherine, they spent that night feeling useful in a way that royal ceremonies had never provided. They fell asleep on narrow cots in the shelter, surrounded by families who had welcomed them not as visiting dignitaries, but as fellow human beings helping each other through a difficult time. When they woke the next morning, the storm had passed and the sun was shining. The flooding had been less severe than feared, and no lives had been lost. As families began returning to assess their homes, many stopped to thank William and Catherine for staying to help. "You didn't have to do that," said Jennifer, a single mother whose home had been damaged but not destroyed. "But you did it anyway. That means something." As William and Catherine prepared to finally leave the Bahamas, they both realized that the night in the emergency shelter had taught them more about effective royal service than any training or briefing ever could. The flight home from Nassau was quieter than any plane journey William and Catherine had taken together. Both sat looking out their respective windows, processing everything that had happened during the most intense week of their royal lives. The usual post-tour debrief with staff was postponed. They needed time to understand their own thoughts before explaining them to anyone else. Catherine held a small notebook that she had started keeping during the Jamaica portion of the tour. It was filled with names, contact information, and ideas that had emerged from her conversations with people throughout the Caribbean. Sarah from the Women's Shelter in Kingston, Marcus from the Youth Forum in Nassau, Mrs. Johnson from the Emergency Shelter. Real people with real stories that had changed how she understood her role. William had his own notebook, but his was filled with policy questions and institutional challenges that the tour had revealed. How could the Commonwealth evolve to be truly voluntary rather than historically obligated? What would reparations conversations look like if they were approached honestly rather than defensively? How could climate change assistance be delivered effectively rather than symbolically? "I keep thinking about what Marcus asked me," Catherine said quietly, breaking the long silence between them. About what I would actually do differently when I got home. I have a list now, but I'm not sure how to make it happen within all the protocols and traditions. William turned from his window to look at his wife. She seemed older somehow, more serious than the woman who had left London a week earlier. The tour had matured both of them in ways that years of regular royal duties hadn't accomplished. "I've been thinking about the same thing," William replied. "We can't just go back to ribbon cuttings and charity galas and pretend this week never happened. But I also don't know how to change an institution that's been operating the same way for centuries." Catherine opened her notebook and showed William some of the commitments she had written down. Long-term support for the women's shelter in Jamaica, not just a one-time donation, but ongoing partnership. Climate change education that went beyond general awareness to specific action. Youth programs that actually listened to young people's priorities, rather than imposing adult assumptions about what they needed. "These aren't traditional royal projects," Catherine acknowledged. "They're messier and more complicated than the usual patronages. But they feel like what people actually need from us." William showed Catherine his own notes about institutional changes, regular consultations with Commonwealth nations about their relationship preferences, support for climate adaptation projects that addressed real needs rather than symbolic gestures, honest acknowledgement of historical harms in official communications. "The palace is going to resist most of these ideas," William said. "They'll say we're being too political or too controversial. Then we need to be prepared to explain why they're necessary," Catherine replied. "Not political, but human. Not controversial, but honest." As their plane began its descent into London, both William and Catherine felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about returning home. They had left as people who understood their royal roles in traditional terms. They were returning as people who had glimpsed what modern royal service could look like if it prioritized authenticity over comfort. The reunion with their children at Kensington Palace was emotional in unexpected ways. George, Charlotte, and Louis seemed to sense that their parents had experienced something significant, even though they couldn't fully understand what had happened. "Did you help people, Mama?" Charlotte asked, as Catherine tucked her into bed that first night home. "We tried to, sweetheart," Catherine answered. "We learned a lot about better ways to help people in the future." "Were people angry at you?" George asked with the directness that only children possess. William sat on the edge of George's bed and considered how to answer honestly without frightening his son. "Some people were disappointed about things that happened a long time ago, before we were born. But they helped us understand how to do better." "Like when I make a mistake and you help me fix it?" George asked. "Exactly like that." William smiled. "Sometimes grown-ups and even countries need help learning how to fix mistakes." Over the following days, William and Catherine began the challenging process of translating their tour experiences into concrete changes in their royal work. They met with advisors who were supportive and others who were skeptical about their new approaches. Catherine started making plans to return to Jamaica and the Bahamas within 6 months, not for ceremonial visits, but for working partnerships with the organizations she had encountered. William began researching Commonwealth constitutional structures and climate adaptation policies. The media response to their tour was mixed, but generally more positive than they had expected. The photograph of them helping during the hurricane became a symbol of authentic royal service that even Republicans acknowledged as genuine leadership. More importantly to them, they began receiving messages from people they had met during the tour. Sarah sent updates about her nursing studies. Marcus shared an essay he had written about climate justice. Mrs. Johnson sent a card thanking them for treating her with dignity during the emergency. One evening, about 2 weeks after their return, William found Catherine in their private sitting room reading a letter from Patricia Williams in Jamaica. Patricia was writing to update Catherine about new programs at the women's shelter and to invite her to participate in planning sessions for expanding their services. "She's asking me to join video conferences with the women who use the shelter," Catherine told William. "Not as a patron or a donor, but as a partner in figuring out what actually works." William smiled. That's exactly what this tour was supposed to teach us. How to be partners instead of just visitors. Catherine folded the letter carefully. I think we're different people than we were 2 weeks ago. Better people? William asked. More honest people, Catherine replied. And maybe that's the same thing. Neither of them could have predicted that their most challenging royal tour would become the foundation for the most meaningful work of their lives. The criticism and discomfort they had faced in the Caribbean had pushed them to develop new understanding of what royal service could mean in a changing world. The tour that had tested their marriage, their confidence, and their assumptions had ultimately strengthened all three. They had returned home as partners who shared not just love, but purpose.